Welcome back to Perkins Pipes and a new segment here on the channel, something we're going to call Pipe and Verse. And this is a segment where we're only going to be talking about poetry. So lots of good stuff coming up in future videos here. But to kick this off, I've got the bent prince that I made. Just kind of has some nice, elegant lines. And since we're talking about something elegant like poetry, seemed like the pipe to have for this. Got some Peterson early morning pipe in the pipe. So let's get this guy lit. Let's get to talking. This new segment is the result of a fan comment on one of the previous videos. So I want to bring this comment up for you and talk about why we're getting into this. This is going to be so cool. Can't wait to get into this with you. So let me bring this up. And Sirius Zenith 4512 posted on another one of the videos. He says, interesting pipe, Steve. I have pipes that link me to the memories I built while smoking them. I'd love to see you include poetry in your channel. He says, it seems like your thing, my friend. Well, my friend, you are absolutely right. Poetry is one of my big things. He says, I feel quite a few pipe smokers have an interest in poetry, perhaps because the pipe helps to reflect on the message presented through verses. Again, completely agreed. Poetry is something to be enjoyed and reflected on and savored, and boy, that certainly does go right along with pipe. He says, the poem that had the biggest impact on me is probably The Road Not Taken by Robert Frost. It'd be interesting to hear your take on the meaning of that poem. So, I can tell you, Sirius Zenith, that I will not be talking about that poem today, but we will. We're going to be talking about that poem and other Robert Frost poems. I love Robert Frost. I have a neat volume of Frost poetry that my wife gave me many years ago. But for this first episode of Pipe and Verse, it seemed that we needed to talk a little bit about poetry itself. And for a lot of people, the movie Dead Poets Society is going to come to mind. And you may remember that one. It comes back to the 1980s. Robin Williams is this English teacher at a private boys' school in New England. I believe the year set is 1959. And he's teaching them poetry. On the opening day of class, they open up their textbooks, and he has them read an essay by the editor of the textbook. It talks about how to enjoy poetry. And he talks about plotting and measuring the greatness of the poem and the intent of the poem and how artfully it has been constructed and all this sort of stuff. And then their teacher, played by Robin Williams, a fellow named Mr. Keating, says that that's garbage. It's nonsense. He says that's not what it is. In fact, he says we're not laying pipe, right? We're talking about poetry here, and he's exactly right. So poetry isn't something that can be really measured and quantified like that. What is it? Later in the film, he's asked the young men to write a poem as a homework assignment. And one of the boys comes in, he's written something that's just really trivial. He just walks up to the front of the room, reads off his paper. He says, "A cat sat on a mat." Kind of winks at his buddies and goes and sits down. It's like, ha ha, I put one over on you, Mr. Keating. And Mr. Keating then goes on to explain, and he says, sometimes the most beautiful poetry can be about simple things. He says, like a cat, or flower, or rain. He says, you see, poetry can come from anything with the stuff of revelation in it. Now we're getting somewhere. He then introduces them to a club that he and his friends had made when he was at the school, had been a student at the school, called the Dead Poets Society. And they would sneak out and they would go to this cave, and they had a book of poems, and they would sit around and read poems. And one of the young men says, "What do you mean it's just a bunch of guys sitting around reading poems?" And Mr. Keating says, "No, it wasn't just a bunch of guys sitting around reading poems." And he says, "We let it drip from our tongues like honey." It says, "Spirits soared, women swooned, and gods were created." Gentlemen, not a bad way to spend an evening, eh? Poetry is different from prose. Prose is everything from your grocery list to a novel. And certain novels can be poetic. They can have the stuff of revelation in them. And indeed, reading a really well-crafted prose passage can be like letting honey drip from your tongue. So you might ask, what then really is the difference between prose and poetry? Well, that's going to be the first poem that we talk about here on Pipe and Verse. Now, I searched and searched, and I can't find the poetry book that has this poem in it. I don't know. I don't know where I first came across it. I really, really thought I had it in something, some anthology. I've searched everything, and I can't seem to find it. And I don't like reading off a screen. So I did print it out. It was very, very short. And I've used this with my students many times when talking about Latin poetry. It's by the poet Howard Nemerov. Lived from 1920 to 1991. And this particular poem was published in 1980 in a collection of his called Sentences. And the title of the poem, which is almost as long as the poem itself, you can kind of see that there. The title of the poem, "Because You Asked About the Line Between Prose and Poetry." Well, that's what we're asking right here. What is that line between prose and poetry? What's the difference? How do you know? And so he writes this. He says, "Sparrows were feeding in a freezing drizzle that while you watched turned to pieces of snow, riding a gradient invisible from silver aslant to random, white and slow. There came a moment that you couldn't tell, and then they clearly flew instead of fell." I've loved that poem for as long as I've known it. Because it perfectly captures the difference between prose and poetry. And again, some prose can be absolutely beautiful and some prose can be poetic. But let's kind of break this down. And he says, starts off and he says, "Sparrows were feeding in a freezing drizzle." Right away, you've got sound in this. Feeding, freezing. You've got a little internal rhyme in that line. Sparrows were feeding in a freezing drizzle. And not only that, but you've got a little alliteration as well. Feeding, freezing, the F sound repeated. Then freezing, drizzle. You've got the Z sound repeated. So right away in the very first line, there's more going on than you and I would normally put in our conversations. Right? You and I don't talk that way when we're just striking up a quick conversation. And so right away we've started to move into the realm of the poetic. Poetry is a little bit more artistic. It just requires a little bit more creativity, a little bit more thought than, again, just our casual speech or casual writing. Sparrows were feeding in a freezing drizzle that while you watched turned to pieces of snow. Now, depending on where you are in the world, you may have well experienced this. Certainly I have in Indiana. It starts out rain, and you kind of looking outside. Hey, you know what? I think some of that's actually some snow mixed in there. And I like how he says it, pieces of snow. Little individual pieces of snow. Still rain at this point, but there are little individual pieces of snow coming down. Then this beautiful line, riding a gradient invisible. Ooh, beautiful, beautiful line. The flakes are just... The flakes are just not even doing anything themselves. Like the snow is so light. And they're just riding in. And whatever slope they've got, whatever gradient they are riding in on, it's invisible, right? You can't see it. But they're riding the gradient invisible. And then he says, from silver aslant to random, white, and slow. Now, I could talk about this one line for an entire video. You often think of rain as being somehow silvery, right? And you think about water and water droplets that are caught on the ends of trees or on flower petals or leaves, and they kind of look silver. And you imagine the rain coming in at a slant, silver aslant, right? Rain, kind of fast. And then as it changes over to random, white, and slow. And rain is fast, right? Even if it's just a drizzle, rain is fast. And it changes over. And of course, rain is uniform. Rain just comes down straight, right? Because it's heavy. It's water, for heaven's sakes. It's water falling out of the sky. So gravity's taking effect, right? So it's coming in fast. And it's uniform. And it's in straight lines or angled lines. But it's still pretty straight. And then snow comes along. And snowflakes are so light and ethereal that now they are blowing in the wind, and they're random. Why is this flake flying here, and why is this snowflake flying over here? And it's random. And from silver to white, obviously for the snow, and slow. Snow falls slowly from the sky, and so you see that changeover. And then if you look at that whole first stanza, you've also got a nice A-B rhyme scheme. So he says, drizzle, snow, Isabel, slow. Sparrows were feeding in a freezing drizzle that while you watched turned into pieces of snow, riding a gradient invisible, from silver aslant to random, white, and slow. So you've got that rhyme going on there. The end rhyme. Now stay on that last line again for a moment. From silver aslant to random, white, and slow. So you've got a nice cadence. You've got a nice rhythm there. From silver aslant to random, white, and slow. Now if you break that down metrically, from sil, got a little iamb there. From silver aslant, sil, from silver slant, that next little unit is called a dactyl. Unstressed, unstressed, stressed. From silver aslant, bum, 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 and it's kind of fast, like the rain. to random, white, and slow. The last part of the line changes into 3 I ams back to back. And the rhythm slows down. The speed slows down to match the snow. He's actually matching the sound of the words with what he's talking about. I mean, that line is just incredible. From silver aslant to random, white, and slow. And then he's got this couplet. Right, so this rhyming couplet ends with the words tell and fell. There came a moment that you couldn't tell. And again, if you've ever experienced this kind of weather, you know this, where is it snowing? Is it raining? I mean, it seems like there's kind of a mix in there, and you can't quite tell, is it actually one or the other? And then when it's actually crossed over into full-fledged snow, and then they clearly flew instead of fell. And then you know you are in fact into snow, right? Definitely not rain. Rain's not falling, but it's snowflakes flying. Now, at no point in the poem itself does he mention prose and poetry, but he's perfectly captured the difference between prose and poetry. Prose is the rain. Poetry is the snow. Our regular speech, our regular writing tends to be fast, it's direct. I'm going to the store today, and then I'm going to get my oil changed, and then I'm going to come home for dinner. I hope to be home by 6:30. Let's have pizza, right? Just boom, 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 boom. But poetry, like this poem itself, there's rhyme, there's rhythm, there's carefully arranged words where sound and sense go together in a particular way to shape and create meaning. And that's different. That's what poetry is all about. So big thanks to Sirius Zenith for bringing this up. I can't wait to share more poetry with you. There's lots and lots of great stuff. So my goodness, this segment alone, we're going to have so many segments on Perkins Pipes. So certainly if you like this kind of thing, really encourage you to click subscribe. I hope you enjoyed it. Please leave us some comments about this poem, or perhaps your own favorite poems. So would love to hear more from you about that. As Malcolm Guite, poet himself, likes to say, I do these little things in order at last to do nothing. Or as I say in Latin, parva ago ut tandem nihil agam. Have a wonderful day.